An elder sister came from the town to visit a younger one. The elder one was married to a tradesman, and the younger to a peasant. As the two drank tea and talked, the elder sister began to boast and make much of her life in town, how she lived and went about in ease and comfort, dressed her children well, had nice things to eat and drink, and went skating, walking, and to the theatre. The younger sister was vexed at this, and retorted by running down the life of a tradesman's wife and exalting her own country one. For my part, I should not care to exchange my life for yours, she said. I grant you, ours is an uneventful existence, and that we know no excitement. Yet you, on the other hand, with all your fine living, must either do a very large trade indeed, or be ruined. You know the proverb, loss is gain's elder brother. Well, you may be rich today, but tomorrow you may find yourself in the street. We have a better way than that here in the country. The peasant's stomach may be thin, but it's long. As to say, he may never be rich, yet he will always have enough. The elder sister took her up. Enough, indeed. Enough with nothing but your wretched pigs and calves. Enough with no fine dresses or company. Why, however hard your man may work, you have to live in mud and will die there, yes, and your children after you. Oh, no, replied the younger. It's like this with us. Though we may live hardly, the land is at least our own, and we have no need to bow and scrape to anyone. But you in town, you live in an atmosphere of scandal. Today all may be well with you, but tomorrow the evil eye may look upon you, and your husband may find himself tempted away by cards or wine, and you and yours may find yourselves ruined. Is not that so? Pachom, the younger sister's husband, had been listening near the stove. That is true, he said. I've been turning over our Mother Earth since childhood, so I've had no time to get any foolishness into my head. Yet I have one grievance. Too little land. Only give me land, and I fear no man. No, not even the devil himself. The two women finished their tea, chatted a little longer about dress, washed up the crockery, and went to bed. All this time, the devil had been sitting behind the stove and had heard everything. He was delighted when the peasant's wife led her husband on to brag, led him on to boast that once given land, not even the devil himself could take it from him. Splendid, thought the devil. I will try a fall with you. I will give you as much land as you want, and then take it away. Near these peasants there lived a lady landowner with a small property of some 300 acres. Formerly she'd got on well with the peasants, and in no way abused her rights. But she now took as overseer a retired soldier, who began to persecute the peasants with fines. No matter how careful Pachom might be, one of his horses would get into the lady's oats, or a cow stray into her garden, or the calves break into her meadows, and for all these things there would be fines levied. Pachom paid up, and then beat and abused his household. Much trouble did he get into with the overseer for the doings of the summer, so that he felt devoutly thankful to have got his cattle standing in the straw yard again. He regretted the cost of their keep there, yet it cost him less anxiety in other ways. That winter, a rumour went abroad that the Bourail was going to sell her land, and that the overseer was arranging to buy both it and the highway rights attached. This rumour reached the peasants, and they were dismayed. If, they thought, the overseer gets the land, he'll worry us with fines even worse than he did under the Bourail. We must get hold of the property somehow, as we all live round it in a circle. So a deputation from the village commune went to see the Bourail, and besought her not to sell the land to the overseer, but to give them the refusal of it, and they would outbid their rival. To this the Bourail agreed, and the peasants set about arranging for the commune to purchase the whole of her estate. They held a meeting about it, and yet another one, but the matter did not go through. The fact was that the unclean one always defeated their object by making them unable to agree. Then the peasants decided to try to buy the land in separate lots, each man as much as he could, and to this also the Bourail said she was agreeable. Pachom heard one day that a neighbour had bought 60 acres, and that the Bourail had agreed to let half the purchase money stand over for a year. Pachom grew envious. If, he thought, the others could buy up all the land, I shall feel left out in the cold. So he took counsel of his wife. Everyone's buying some, he said, so we too had better get hold of 30 acres. We can't make a living as things are now, for the overseer takes it all out of us in fines. And so they took thought on how to effect the purchase. They had 100 roubles laid by, so that by selling a foal and half their bees, in addition to putting their son out to service, they managed to raise half the money. Pachom collected it all together, selected 45 acres and a small piece of timber land, and went to the Bourail to arrange things. The bargain struck, they shook hands on it, and paid Pachom a deposit. Or rather, Pachom paid a deposit. And then he went to town, completed the conveyance, half the purchase money to be paid now and half within 2 years' time, and lo, Pachom was a landowner. He also borrowed a small sum from his brother-in-law with which to purchase seed. This he duly sowed in his newly acquired property, and a fine crop came up, so that within a year he had repaid both the Bourail and his brother-in-law. He was now an absolute proprietor. It was his own land that he sowed, his own hay that he reaped, his own firewood he cut, and his own cattle he grazed. Whenever he rode out to his inalienable estate, either to gather or inspect crops and meadows, he felt overjoyed. The very grass seemed different from other grasses. The flowers seemed to bloom differently. Once, when he'd ridden over his land, it was just land. But now, although still land, it was land with a difference. Thus did Pachom live for a time, and was happy. Indeed, all would have been well, if only the other peasants had left Pachom's corn and pasture alone. In vain did he make repeated remonstrances. Shepherds would turn their flocks out into his meadows, and horses would somehow get into his corn at night. Again and again Pachom drove them out and overlooked the matter. At last he lost his temper and laid a complaint before the district court. He knew that the peasants only did it from lack of land, not maliciously, and yet it could not be allowed, since they were eating the place up. He must teach them a lesson. So he taught first one of them a lesson in court, and then another, had one fined, and then a second. This aroused feeling against him, and his neighbors now began of set purpose to steal his crops. One man got into the plantation and stripped the bark off no less than 10 linden trees. When Pachom next rode that way and saw what had been done, he turned pale. He drew nearer and saw that the bark had been stripped off and thrown about, and the trunks uprooted. One tree only had the miscreant left, after lopping off all its branches, but the rest he had cleared entirely in his evil progress. Pachom was furious. Ah, he thought, if only I knew who'd done this, I'd soon get my own back on him. Wondered and wondered who it could be. If anyone in particular, it must be Semka. So he went to see Semka, but got nothing out of him except bad language. Yet he felt more certain than ever now that it was Semka who'd done it. He laid a complaint against him, and they were both summoned to attend the court. The magistrate sat and sat, and then dismissed the case for want of evidence. This enraged Pachom still more. He abused both the village headman and the magistrates. "You magistrates," he said, "are in league with thieves. If you were honest men, you'd never have acquitted Semka." Yes, there was no doubt that Pachom was ill-pleased both with the magistrates and with his neighbors. He began to live more and more apart on his land, and to have less and less to do with the village commune. At this time, there arose a rumor that some of the peasantry thereabouts were thinking of emigrating. This made Pachom think to himself, "But there's no reason why I should leave my land. If some of the others go, why, it'll make all the more room for me. I can buy up their land, and so hedge myself in all round. I should live much more comfortably then. At present I'm too cramped." It happened soon afterwards that Parchom was sitting at home one day when a travelling peasant dropped in. Parchom gave him a night's lodging and a meal, and then questioned him, in the course of conversation, as to whence in the name of God he had come. To this the peasant replied that he'd come from lower down the river, from a spot beyond the Volga, where he'd been in service. Then he went on to tell how a settlement was being formed there, every settler being enrolled in the commune and allotted 30 acres of land. It was such land, too, he said, and grew such rye. Why, the straw of the rye was tall enough to hide a horse, and thick enough together to make a sheaf per 5 handfuls. One peasant, he went on, who had arrived there a poor man, and had nothing but his 2 hands to work with, now grew his 150 acres of wheat. Indeed, during the past year, that man had made 5,000 rubles by his wheat alone. Parchom's soul was fired by this, and he thought to himself, why should I stay here, poor and cramped up, when I might be making such a fine living as that? I'll sell out here, both land and homestead, and go and build myself a new house and farm there with the money. Here in this cramped-up spot, life is one long worry. At any rate, I might take a trip there and make inquiries. So when the summer came, he got himself ready and set out. He took a steamer down the Volga to Samara, and thence tramped 300 miles till he came to the place. It was all as had been described. The peasants lived splendidly, with 30 acres of free land to each soul, and he was assured of a welcome by the commune. Moreover, he was told that anyone who came there with money could buy additional land, as much as ever he wanted, right out and in perpetuity. For a ruble an acre, a man could have the very finest land possible, and to any extent. All this Parchom learnt, and then returned home in the autumn. He began straightway to sell out, and succeeded in disposing of land, buildings, and stock at a profit. Then he took his name off the commune's books, waited for the spring, and departed to the new place with his family. They duly arrived at their destination, and Parchom was forthwith enrolled in the commune of the great settlement, after moistening the elders' throats, of course, and executing the necessary documents. Then they took him and assigned him 150 acres of land, 30 for each soul in his family, in different parts of the estate, in addition to common pasturage. Parchom built himself a homestead and stocked it, his allotted land alone being twice what he'd formerly possessed in the old place. It was corn-bearing land, too. Altogether, life was 10 times better here than where he had come from, for he had at his disposal both arable and pasture land, sufficient of the latter always to keep as many cattle as he cared to have. At first, while building and stocking, he thought everything splendid. Later, when he'd settled down a bit, he began to feel cramped again. He wanted to grow white Turkish wheat, as several others did, but there was hardly any wheat-bearing land among his 5 allotments. Wheat needed to be grown on grass, new or fallow land, and such land had to be sown 1 year and then left fallow for 2, in order that the grass might grow again. True, he had as much soft land as he wanted, but it would only bear rye. Wheat required hard land, and hard land found many applicants, and there was not enough for all. Moreover, such land gave rise to disputes. The richer peasants sowed their own, but the poorer had to mortgage theirs to merchants. The first year, Parchom sowed his allotments with wheat, and got splendid crops. Then he wanted to sow them with wheat again, but they were not large enough to admit both of sowing new land and of leaving last year's land to lie fallow. He must get hold of some more. So he went to a merchant and took a year's lease of some wheat land. He sowed as much of it as he could and reaped a magnificent crop. Unfortunately, however, the land was a long way from the settlement. In fact, the crop had to be carted 10 miles. So, as Parchom had seen merchant farmers living in fine homesteads and growing rich in the district where the land lay, he thought to himself, how much better it would be if I took a long lease of it and built a homestead there the same as they've done. Then I should be right on the land. and so he set about arranging to do so. And thus did Parchom live for 5 years, continually taking up land and sowing it with wheat. All the years were good ones. The wheat thrived, and the money came in. Yet, just to live and live was rather tedious, and Parchom began to tire of leasing land every year in the strange district and removing his stock there. Wherever there was a particularly good plot of land, there would be a rush made for it by the other peasants, and it would be divided up before he was ready to lease and sow it as a whole. Once he went into shares with a merchant in leasing a plot of pasturage from some peasants and ploughed it up. And then the peasants lost the land in a lawsuit, and his labour went for nothing. If only it had been his own land, absolutely, he need have given in to no one and been put to no trouble. So he began to cast about where he could buy an estate outright. In this endeavour he fell in with a certain peasant who had ruined himself and was ready to let him have his 1,500 acres property cheap. So Parchom entered into negotiation with him, and after much discussion closed at 1,000 roubles, half down and half to stand over. One day, after they thus clinched the matter, a merchant drove up to Parchom's homestead to bait his horses. They drank a teapot empty and talked. The merchant said he'd come a long, long way, from the country of the Bashkirs, in fact, where, so he said, he'd bought 15,000 acres for only 1,000 roubles. Parchom went on to question him further, and the merchant to answer. All I did, said the latter, was to make the elders there a few presents, coats, carpets, and a chest of tea, to distribute about 100 roubles, and to stand vodka to anyone who felt inclined for it. As a result, I got the land for 10 kopecks an acre, and he showed Parchom the deed. The property, he concluded, fronts upon a river, and is all of it open grass steppe land. Parchom questioned him still further. You would not, said the merchant, find such land as that in a year. The same with all the Bashkir land. Moreover, the people there are as simple as sheep. You can get things out of them absolutely for nothing. Well, thought Parchom, what's the good of my giving 1,000 roubles for only 1,500 acres and still leaving a debt round my neck, when there I might become a proprietor of indeed for the same money? So Parchom asked the merchant how to reach the country of the Bashkirs, and as soon as his informant had departed, got ready for the journey. Leaving his wife at home and taking with him only his workmen, he set out first for the town, where he bought a chest of tea, vodka, and other gifts, as the merchant had advised him. And then Parchom and his workmen drove on, until they'd covered 400 miles, and on the 7th day they arrived at the camp of the Bashkirs. Everything turned out to be as the merchant had said. The people there lived in hide-covered wagons, which were drawn up by the side of a river running through the open steppe. They neither ploughed the land nor ate corn, while over the steppe wandered droves of cattle and Cossack horses, the foals being tied to the backs of the wagons and their dams driven up to them twice a day to give them milk. The chief sustenance of the people was mare's milk, which the women made into a drink called kumis, and then churned the kumis into cheese. In fact, the only drink the Bashkirs knew was either kumis or tea, their only solid food mutton, and their only amusement pipe playing. Nevertheless, they all of them looked sleek and cheerful and kept holiday the whole year round. In education they were sadly deficient and knew no Russian, but they were kindly and attractive folk for all that. As soon as they caught sight of Parchom, they came out of their wagons and surrounded the guest. An interpreter was found, and Parchom told him that he'd come to buy the land. At once the people were delighted, and embraced Parchom fervently, escorted him to a well-appointed wagon, where they made him sit down on a pile of rugs topped with soft cushions, and set about getting some tea and kumis ready. A sheep was killed, and a meal served of the mutton, after which Parcom produced the gifts from his carriage, distributed them round, and shared out also the tea. Then the Bashkirs fell to talking among themselves for a while, and finally bade the interpreter speak. "I am to tell you," said the interpreter, "that they are greatly taken with you, and that it is our custom to meet the wishes of a guest in every possible way, in return for the presents given us. Since, therefore, you have given us presents, say now what there is of ours which you may desire, so that we may grant it you." "What I particularly desire," said Parcom, "is some of your land. Where I come from, there's not enough land, and what there is all ploughed out, whereas you have much land and good land, such as I've never before beheld." The interpreter translated, and the Bashkirs talked again among themselves. Although Parcom could not understand what they were saying, he could see that they kept crying out something in merry tones, and then bursting into laughter. At last they stopped and looked at Parcom while the interpreter spoke. "I am to tell you," he said, "that in return for your kindness we are ready to sell you as much land as you may wish. Merely make a gesture with your hand to signify how much, and it shall be yours." At this point, however, the people began to talk among themselves again, and to dispute about something. On Parcom asking what it was, the interpreter told him, "Some of them say that the head man ought to be asked first about the land, and that nothing should be done without him, while others say that that is not necessary." Suddenly, while the Bashkirs were thus disputing, there entered the wagon a man in a foxskin cap, at whose entry everyone rose, while the interpreter said to Parcom, "This is the head man himself." At once Parcom caught up the best coat and offered it to the newcomer, as well as 5 pounds of tea. The head man duly accepted them, and then sat down in the place of honor, while the Bashkirs began to expound to him on some matter or another. He listened and listened, then gave a smile and spoke to Parcom in Russian. "Very well," he said. "Pray choose your land wheresoever it pleases you. We have much land." "So I am to take as much as I want," thought Parcom. "Still, I must strengthen that bargain somehow. They might say the land is yours and then take it away again." "I thank you," he said aloud, "for your kind speech. As you say, you have much land, whereas I am in need of some. I only desire to know precisely which of it is to be mine, wherefore it might be well to measure it off by some method, and duly convey it to me. God only is Lord of life and death, and although you are good people who give it to me, it might befall that your children would take it away again." The head man smiled. "The conveyance is already executed. This present meeting is our mode of confirming it, and it could not be a surer one." "But I've been told that a merchant visited you recently, and that you sold him land and gave him a proper deed of conveyance. Pray, therefore, do the same with me." The head man understood now. "Very well. We have a writer here who will go to town and procure the necessary seals." "But what is the price of your land?" asked Parcom. "Our price is only 1,000 rubles per day." Parcom did not understand this day rate at all. But how many acres would that include?" "We do not reckon it that way," said the head man. "We sell it only by the day. That is to say, as much land as you can walk round in a day, that much land is yours. That is our measure, and the price, 1,000 rubles. Parcom was astounded. Why, a man might walk round a great deal in a day. The head man smiled again. "Well, at all events, it will be yours. Only there's one condition, namely, that if on that same day you do not return to the spot whence you started, your money is forfeited." "But how do you decide on that spot?" "We take our stand upon whatsoever spot you may select. I and my people remain here, while you start off and describe a circle. Behind you will ride some of our young men, to plant stakes wherever you may desire that to be done. Thereafter, a plough will be driven round those stakes. Describe what circle you wish, only by the time of the setting of the sun you must have returned to the place from which you started. As much land as you may circle, that much land will be yours. So Pachom accepted these terms, and it was agreed to make an early start on the morrow. Then the company talked again, drank more kumis, ate more mutton, passing on thence to tea, the ceremonies being prolonged until nightfall. At length Pachom was led to a bed of down, and the Bashkirs dispersed, after first promising to gather on the morrow beyond the river and ride out to the appointed spot before sunrise. Pachom lay on his bed of down, but could not get a wink of sleep for thinking of the land, which, as he said, I'm going to farm here. For I mean to mark out a very large promised land tomorrow, he continued to himself. I can cover at least 40 miles in the day, and 40 miles should enclose somewhere about 20,000 acres. And then I'll be under nobody's thumb, and able to afford a pair-ox plough and 2 labourers. I'll plough up the best land and feed stock on the rest. All that night Pachom never closed his eyes, but dozed off for a short while just before dawn. The instant he did so, he had a dream. He seemed to be lying in this identical wagon and listening to somebody laughing and talking outside. Wishing to see who it was that was laughing so much, he went outside and saw the head man sitting on the ground and holding his sides as he rolled about in ecstasies of mirth. Then in his dream, Pachom walked up to him and asked him what the joke was, and immediately saw that it was not the head man at all, but the merchant who had so lately visited him to tell him about this land. And then again he'd scarcely so much as said to the merchant, "Did I not see you at my home a little while ago?" when the merchant suddenly changed into the peasant from way down the Volga, who'd called at his farm in the old country. Finally Pachom saw that this peasant was not a peasant at all, but the devil himself with horns and hoofs, and that he was gazing fixedly at something as he sat there and laughed. And Pachom thought to himself, what's he looking at, and why does he laugh so much? And in his dream he stepped a little aside to look, and saw a man, barefooted and clad only in a shirt and breeches, lying flat on his back, with his face as white as a sheet. And presently, looking yet more attentively at the man, Pachom saw the man was himself. He gave a gasp and woke feeling as if the dream was real. And then he looked to see if it were getting light yet, and saw the dawn was near. Time to start. I must arouse these good people. Pachom arose, woke his workman in the carriage, and told him to put the horse in and go round to call the Bashkirs, since it was time to go out upon the steppe and measure off the land. So the Bashkirs arose and got themselves ready, and the head man arrived. They breakfasted off kumis, and were for giving Pachom some tea, but he could not wait. If we are to go, let us go, he said. It's fully time. And so the Bashkirs harnessed up and set out, some on horseback and some in carts, while Pachom drove in his carriage with his workmen. They came out upon the steppe just as the dawn was breaking, and proceeded towards a little knoll, called in the Bashkir dialect a shikhan. There were people in carts who were lighted, and everyone collected together. The head man approached Pachom and pointed all round with his hand. Whatsoever land you see from here is ours. Choose whichsoever direction you like. Pachom's eyes glowed, for all the land was grass, level as the palm of his hand, and black beneath the turf as a poppy head. Only where there was a ravine was there a break in the grass which was everywhere breast high. The head man took off his fox-skin cap and laid it in the exact center of the knoll. This will be the mark. Lay you your money in it, and your servant shall remain with it while you are gone. From this mark you will start, and to this mark you will return. As much land as you circle, all of it will be yours. Pachom took out his money and laid it in the cap. Then he divested himself of his cloak, stripped himself to his waistcoat, tightened his belt around his stomach, thrust his wallet with some bread into his bosom, tied a flask of water to his shoulder strap, pulled up his long boots, and prepared to start. He kept debating within himself which direction it would be best to take, for the land was so good everywhere. Oh, well, as it's all the same, I'll walk towards the rising sun, he decided at length. So he turned his face that way and kept trying his limbs while waiting for the sun to appear. I must lose no time, he thought, for I shall do my best walking while the air is yet cool. Then the mounted Bashkirs also ascended the knoll and stationed themselves behind Pachom. No sooner had the sun shot his first rays above the horizon than Pachom started forward and walked out into the steppe, the mounted men riding behind them. He walked neither slowly nor hurriedly. After he'd gone about a mile, he stopped and had a stake put in. Then he went on again. He was losing his first stiffness and beginning to lengthen his stride. Presently he stopped again and had another stake put in. He looked up at the sun, which was now lighting the knoll clearly, with the people standing there, and calculated that he'd gone about 4 miles. He was beginning to grow warm now, so he took off his waistcoat and then fastened up his belt again. Then he went on another 4 miles and stopped. It was growing really hot now. He looked at the sun again and saw that it was breakfast time. One stage done, he thought, but there are 4 of them in the day, and it's early yet to change my direction. Still, I must take my boots off. And so he sat down and took them off and went on again. Walking was easier now. As soon as I've covered another 4 miles, he reflected, I'll begin to bend round to the left. That spot was exceedingly well chosen. The farther I go, the better the land is. And so he kept straight on, although when he looked round, the knoll was almost out of sight, and the people on it looked like little black ants. Now, he said to himself at length, I've made the circle large enough and must bend round. He'd sweated a good deal and was thirsty, so he raised the flask and took a drink. Then he had a stake put in at that point and bent round sharply to the left. On he went and on, through the high grass and the burning heat. He was beginning to tire now, and glancing at the sun, saw it was dinner time. Now, he thought to himself, I might venture to take a rest. So he stopped and ate some bread, though without sitting down, since he said to himself, if I once sat down, I should go on lying down and end up by going to sleep. So he waited a little till he felt rested, and then he went on again. At first he found the walking easy, for the meal had revived his strength. But presently the sun seemed to grow all the hotter as it began to slant towards evening. Pachom was nearly worn out now, yet he merely thought to himself, an hour's pain may a century gain. He covered about 8 miles of this last lap of the circle, and was about to bend inwards again to the left, when he caught sight of an excellent bit of land round a dry ravine. A pity to leave that out. Flax would grow so splendidly there. So he kept straight on until he'd taken in the ravine, and after having had a stake planted on the spot, again wheeled inwards. Looking towards the knoll, he could see that the people there were almost indistinguishable. They could not be less than 12 miles away. Well, he thought, I've covered the 2 long laps of the circuit, and must take this last one by the shortest cut possible. So he started upon the last lap and quickened his pace. Once again he looked at the sun. It was now drawing near to the time of the evening meal, and he'd only covered 2 miles of the distance. The starting point was still 10 miles away. I must hurry straight along now, however rough the country be. I must not take in a single extra piece on the way. I've enclosed sufficient as it is, and Pachom headed straight for the knoll. He pressed on straight in its direction, He had found walking very difficult now. His feet were aching badly, for he chafed and bruised them, and they were beginning to totter under him. He'd have given anything to have rested for a while, yet knew that he must not if he were to regain the knoll before sunset. The sun at least would not wait. Nay, it was like a driver ever lashing him on. Time to time he staggered. Surely I've not miscalculated. Surely I've not taken in too much land ever to get back, however much I hurry. Such a long way to go yet, and I'm dead beat. It cannot be that all my money and toil have gone in vain. I must just do my best. So Parkhom pulled himself together and broke into a run. He'd torn his feet till they were bleeding, yet still he ran further and further. Waistcoat, boots, flask, cap, he flung them all away. I was too pleased with what I saw. Me the more breathless, his shirt and breeches clinging and his mouth parched. I was too pleased with what I saw. His shirt and breeches clinging and his mouth parched, and his breath parched. His heart was working, and while his legs steam hammer him, and to be no longer to be breaking under him, and to be no longer his own. He lost all thought of the land now. All he thought of was to avoid dying of exertion. Yet although he was so afraid of dying, he could not stop. To have gone so far, and then to stop. Why, they'd think me a fool. By this time, he could hear the Bashkirs cheering and shouting to him, and their cries stirred his heart with fresh spirit. On he ran with his last remaining strength, while the sun was just touching the horizon. But he was close to the spot now. He could see the people on the knoll waving. He could see the fox-skin cap lying on the ground, the money in it, the head man sitting beside it with his hands pressed to his sides. Suddenly Parkhom remembered his dream. Yet I've much land now. If only God should bring me safe to live upon it. But my heart misgives me that I have killed myself. But he ran on. For the last time he looked at the sun. Large and red, it had touched the earth and was beginning to sink below the horizon. Parkhom reached the knoll just as it set. Oh, he cried in his despair, for he thought everything was lost. Suddenly, however, he remembered that he could not see from below so well as the people on the knoll above him, and that to them the sun would still seem not to have set. He rushed to the slope, and could see it. He scrambled up, that the cap was still there. He stumbled and fell. Yet in the very act of falling, stretched out his hands towards the cap and touched it. Ah, young man, said the head man. Indeed. Parkhom's servant ran to his master and tried to raise him. But blood was running from his mouth. Parkhom lay there, dead. The servant cried out in consternation, but the head man remained sitting on his haunches, laughing and holding his hands to his sides. At length he got up, took a spade from the ground and threw it to the servant. The Bashkirs arose and departed. Only the servant remained. He dug a grave of the same length from 3 to